party structure that's a little bit more congealed, a little bit more firm, and that will give the Russians and other groups looking to launch propaganda efforts into the United States a lot less purchase. But we still have to get from there to here to there in an era when Facebook is literally marketing your data and Twitter has lost all content moderation. So this, I don't want to say this is going to get worse before it gets better, but we are definitely not out of the woods. It's possible, but it's a little messy and it's a little too early to know for sure. So part of the problem we saw with white workers specifically, they're far more likely to be unionized. And it's the unions that have really gotten hurt the most by globalization, because ultimately globalization was about finding the lowest cost and or most efficient producers. And in non-high skill industries, that was typically not union. So if you're working for Airbus as part of a union, maybe you are high skill, and you can compete with everyone. If you're sewing underwear in Kentucky, probably not. And so it's really skill based. And if your job is protected not because you're good at it, but because you have a bunch of other workers working with you, then those are the folks that got hit hard. Now, yes, manufacturing in the United States actually never dipped in terms of total output, both absolute and relative terms. It went up during globalization, but it became a lot more focused on those high-end jobs with the high value add. And the low-end jobs, those are the ones we lost, whether it's in Mexico or China or anywhere else. When those jobs come back, they will generate a lot of high-paying jobs, not low-paying ones, because we now have had 30 years of technological advancement that improves what we can do. So I think textiles is the great example. Textiles was driven out of business because of NAFTA, and then it went out of Mexico into China because of the WTO. And so people who grew up in those families, had those jobs, they're never going to trust globalization. It's hard to argue with them. But now that it's coming back, it looks very different. This is not sewing seams. You can have one software engineer and one mechanic, and they can maintain a 2-acre facility that can make finished clothes faster and cheaper than 150 Bangladeshi seamstresses. Now, if you get one of those two jobs, great, you're pulling down 6 figures making textiles. But it takes so many fewer people than it used to. So in order for these people to appreciate what's happening as things renationalize and reshore, massive retraining is going to be required. Now, we are in a labor shortage, so there's a lot of business efforts going into retraining, but they're going to focus on the communities where they think things are going to work, and those communities already have to have a certain level of skilled labor in order to justify the investment in the first place. So if you're in a primarily rural area and there's not a significant population center near you, you're probably not going to make the cut unless you're willing to relocate. Because underclass implies you're doing a menial job to service people with higher skill set. These are people who are closer to being destitute, because it's just difficult to imagine the sort of industry that was lost coming back in a way that benefits them at all. Now, if they can move into a different sector, and one of the things we learned with COVID is the technology has come a long way in terms of interpersonal communication, and you can do a lot of things remote. That's great, but that's probably not manufacturing. Well,
right, and there are lots of them, unfortunately.
We all say we love a merit-based system until we realize that 50% of the population is below average. And the United States doesn't have a good political answer to that simple fact.
Does anybody?
Yes. Now, in the United States, we look down on this, but if you were in most of Europe and if you're in Europe and you don't exactly have a great skill set, and you're not particularly bright, there are still going to be networks of jobs that you can do. Also, most of the European countries don't have nearly as immigration-friendly of a culture as the United States. And so you can't just import semi-skilled workers or unskilled workers from another country to do the unfashionable jobs. It's the locals who do them. That doesn't happen here.
Okay. Yeah.
I remember when I lived in New Zealand in the 90s, the first time I saw a team of white people in orange jumpsuits doing industrial custodial work. I had never seen that before. Illiberalism digs in when people feel disconnected from their economic and social and political structure.
Yeah.
So it absolutely factors in. Now, the United States is in the midst of a labor shortage, which is one of the reasons that I think a more open immigration system would be good. I'm also not blind about this, and it has to happen in a legal way. We haven't had meaningful reform of the immigration system since 1987. It's time for Congress to pick this up again. And there's a lot of, I don't want to say easy fixes, but relatively quick ones. Now, what's going on at the border at the moment is Donald Trump had a series of policies, which included Title 42 as a COVID method, that allowed the federal government to basically kick people across the border back to Mexico. The problem with that is because it was based on health as opposed to status or legalities, they could just turn around and come right back in. And so we got this laundry machine churn at the border for the last 3 years. And when Biden came in, there were a lot of folks within the Democratic coalition who were relatively pro-immigration, primarily because Donald Trump was anti-immigration. And so when Biden inherited this problem, he ended up using most of the same tools that the Trump administration used. But because he was perceived as being less anti-migration, people just kept jumping into that laundry machine. So what is happening right now, the week of, it's May 12th when I'm saying this, is that the Biden administration has done away with Title 42 and put in a two-pronged program. Now, this has only been in place for like 2 days, so God knows if it's going to work. But step one is doing something we have not done since the 70s and sending staff down to Central America to run processing centers. The idea is you register with American Immigration before you even leave your country. And so if you've got a claim of prosecution or asylum, they can resolve that hopefully very quickly and have larger, more robust, more reliable means for legal migration. However, if you show up at the border without having first gone to the processing center, they've changed the definition of asylum so that 99% of people crossing the border automatically do not qualify. So, for example, if you start in Honduras and you pass through Guatemala and Mexico on your way there, you are automatically disqualified, because if you are going for asylum, that means you're scared to live at home and you crossed any international border on your way. Well, clearly you're lying. And so they don't even have to look at your case. And if you do that, you cannot even apply at a processing center for the next 5 years. The goal is to end the laundry machine. Now, will this work? God knows. And there are other clauses in this that various folks across the country don't have problems with, so the legal challenges have already begun. But for the first time since Reagan, we're trying something new. The goal is to have enough staff there that within 12 to 24 hours you can give them a yes or a no. And by eliminating asylum as an option, almost no one is going to qualify. Now, like I said, this has only been in place for a couple of days, and there was a huge surge of people that came up in the last couple of weeks. There's a huge surge of people waiting, and they've all just pushed across. So in the short term, this isn't going to do jack.